Hi there. I didn't know it was going to happen that quickly. I was just socializing over there. Hi. My second trip to Berlin. And the first trip was to the same hotel, and I never got out of it, and it looks like that's going to be the same thing for the second trip. So I've become an expert in the Estrel Hotel. So just a real quick, I only have 30 minutes, so I kind of move along quickly. Just to give you a little idea about who I am and where I came from, as I did work on the Apple advertising for about 4.5 years after Steve Jobs returned in '97, and I worked with him for 8 years on Next, which is the company he started, as you probably know, when he was forced out of Apple. So I basically spent 12 years working with Steve, and you've probably heard that he wasn't the easiest guy to work with. So during that 12 years, I'm proud to say he only beat me up twice. And if you annualize that, it's actually one of the better ratios that you'll find amongst people who worked with the man. So I also worked with these other companies, Dell and Intel, most notably, that were very complicated. And I wrote a book about simplicity. And to be honest, a lot of the inspiration for the book was these other companies I worked with, because they made things so damn difficult. We worked probably 3 times as long and spent 3 times as much money, and we ended up doing work that wasn't nearly as high quality, and it was because Apple was simpler. I also worked, I should confess, because I'm in Germany, that I was the global creative director on BMW for a few years. So I did sneak into the country a couple times, but to go to Munich to work on the BMW business. But I don't include them as my examples of complexity, because I actually had a pretty good time working with those guys. My story with Apple starts in 1997 when Steve Jobs came back. This was a cover of Wired magazine that was pretty famous. Basically, as Steve would say in later years, Apple was at this point 90 days from bankruptcy. And yet, in a mere 14 years from that point, Apple became the most valuable company on the face of the earth, which is pretty remarkable. Never happened before, will likely never happen again. And I believe it's because of this thing about simplicity, that Apple just has being a technology company that makes things easier for people and makes their devices so easy to understand, set them apart from the crowd. And this is something that wasn't just true of the products that Apple makes. It's actually throughout the organization. It was in the retail stores, in the advertising, in the organization of the company. Everything about Apple reflected Steve Jobs' love of simplicity, and it's what really set them apart from these bigger, more complicated companies. The reason simplicity works is because it's simple, and the world is complicated. And when you do something that's simple, you stand out from all the busy things around you. You could look at Apple's products and make the same observation that this is an extreme example, but when Apple makes a remote control, they don't do what the TV makers do with their remote controls. They put the things that you use every day right up top, where you can access them very simply, and you don't need an instruction manual to figure out what the remote does. You can do more tricks with it. You drill down a little bit, but the things you use every day are right there on the top. So when Steve Jobs came back in 1997, we created this Think Different campaign, which was kind of famous where I come from. I'm not sure how much of it played here, to be honest. But we never showed a computer in our campaign because we had none to talk about, really. The iMac was going to be 6 months away at this point. And Steve Jobs wanted to tell the world that Apple was alive and well after 11 years of fairly mediocre products and performance. So we created this campaign, the launch commercial, which you may be familiar with, called The Crazy Ones. Steve was very, very into that. He didn't write it, as some people believe, this first commercial, but he was an active participant. He was a great client, and he gave us a lot of feedback along the way. He loved the commercial so much, and he believed it was so important for Apple, that we said to him, you should be the voiceover for it, because why would we pay an actor who's going to pretend to believe the stuff when you really do? Well, Steve thought this was not a good idea because he would be a distraction. People would see the commercial and they would wonder why this egomaniac has to be the voice on his own commercial. So he rejected the idea, but at our insistence, he said, okay, I'll record a version for you. So we went into the Apple auditorium one day where there was a lone microphone stand set up, And Steve kept us waiting about a half hour, and he showed up and said, I'm really busy today. I don't think I should be doing this. I will give you one take, and I'm out of here. So good attitude. We could work with that. And we did, and he recorded this version that is actually pretty darn good. You might have seen it. I'm going to play you the version of this commercial with Steve doing the voice in his one take. And he did a really good job. So this is the launch commercial for Think Different.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
So just so you know what it was like to work with the guy, just imagine he gives that pretty quiet, thoughtful read, and his words were hanging in the air, are the ones who do. Then there was a moment of silence, and then he said, that's it, this is a horrible idea, and he stormed off the stage. But he did a pretty good job, I think. I'm not sure how many of you saw the movie Jobs that came out last year, but not many people did, apparently. The last scene in the movie was him recording this, and they had him in a beautiful recording studio, which was not the case, and he gave that read, and then he looks at the camera and he goes, is that okay? Like that. That's not how it happened. I was there. Anyway, so the first lesson in simplicity here, though, comes from the words think simple. We were looking to tell the world that Apple was alive and well. We needed to express Apple's values to the world. And Steve was not a fan of advertising. He didn't like anything that sounded like an ad. So I wish I could say I wrote the words Think Different. I did not. An art director did. Damn him. But he captured the spirit pretty darn well. And the reason I love those words are that you could have put them up in the garage when Jobs and Wozniak created their very first computer. They would have been appropriate then, and they would be appropriate today if you used them with an Apple Watch, for example. They capture what the company was all about, and they were authentic. And authenticity is something that is often lacking in people's advertising and communications. When I've worked with a lot of companies to do a brand campaign, the first thing we do, we'll spend a month trying to figure out who it is they want to be, and then once we all agree on that, we go out and create advertising. That wasn't the case with Apple. We knew exactly who Apple was, and we wanted something authentic. So Think Different was really an authentic depiction of who Apple was as a company. So then there's the matter of that little thing, the I. And I proudly say I'm the author of the I. It's actually, I say proudly, I'm actually embarrassed and humbled by it because I'm a writer. You have to keep that in mind, and I swear I've written longer things than this. But this is the one that seems to follow me about, so I milk it for all it's worth. And I won't be able to for too much longer because with Apple Pay, Apple Watch, Apple Music, it is apparent that the I is being retired, so we must bid it adieu at this point. But it certainly worked for Apple for quite a bit of time. It was the name of the iMac, which I'll explain a little bit more in a bit. And then it became all these other I things for Apple. And then other companies around the world started making I things to sort of cash in on Apple's I thing. I found this one in Copenhagen, one of my favorites. And funny as it is, it actually captures the reason for the I. When we were called into Steve's meeting one day, it was 2 weeks before the introduction of the iMac, and we needed a name for it. Steve had a name that he really, really liked, and he wanted to see if we could beat it. But the name that he liked for the computer was MacMan. So we had a similar reaction, but he didn't think it was that funny. And I don't know if you, how many geniuses you've worked for in your day, but He was a human being like everyone else, and he sometimes liked things with no real reason for liking them. And MacMan was one. It had a lot not going for it, but he liked it, so we had to go off and do new things. And we came back with 5 names, iMac being one of them. That was our recommendation, and he hated it. He hated all 5 names, actually. We came back a week later with new names. He hated those, and we pulled out iMac again, and he this time said, I don't hate it, but I still don't like it. 2 days later, I found out that he had the name silkscreened on a model, and he was showing it around inside Apple, and there was never another peep. There was no moment of glory, no dramatic email or phone call, but it became an iMac. And it was really because we persevered. We did not let up on that because we believed in it, the creative team. And it's a good thing we did persevere, because I fear, had we not, you might be sitting there with your phone mans today or your pod mans, and that would be kind of silly. So again, about authenticity, when we were building up Think Different as an idea for Apple, that captured the spirit of the company. And 6 months later, this computer came out that didn't look like anything anybody had ever seen before. It looks kind of ugly by today's standards, but back then all computers were beige and boxy and boring, and here was this translucent blue computer all in one. So because we had seeded Think Different as the campaign idea for 6 months preceding, all we really had to do was show a picture of that computer and say Think Different under it, and it would have been a perfectly fine ad, which just, again, proves how authentic those words were to Apple. And we used those words as basically as the period for every communication that we presented. So any headline, any ad had to end logically in Think Different. Just as when we worked with BMW, the ultimate driving machine had to be the final statement on every ad. So we had something that we could stick to that really defined the company, and that was a real guide for making our ads simple. So I have 5 things that I talk about simplicity very quickly. One of them is that it's about creating love. The thing that Steve said probably more times than anything else was it was our job to make people love Apple, that he wanted this emotional connection. And there were 3 reasons why he wanted people to have that connection to Apple. 1 is they'd keep buying stuff, which is important. But 2, they would evangelize to their friends, their families, and their colleagues. And then 3, they'd stick with the company when the bad thing happens. And inevitably, bad things happen. They cannot be predicted. And if you don't have that emotional connection and the bad thing happens, they just leave. And he wanted to keep people as customers, no matter what might happen. The reason why, the thing that allowed us to build the love was by making things simple for people. Because human beings have this in their DNA to prefer simpler solutions. If you give them simple solutions, they feel better about you. And my example of that is this that I saw on a bus in New York City a couple of years ago now. I'm not sure if they do this all around the world. I know they do it in several countries, but McDonald's is selling any size cup of coffee for $1. And I looked at that as a non-McDonald's customer and a non-coffee drinker, and it made me like McDonald's more. That got me thinking about the value of simplicity. They would give me this much or that much for the same price, and they'd charge $1 as opposed to the $5 that Starbucks would charge. So this made me like them. I appreciated that they're doing something that made people's lives simpler. It was really easy to understand and was somewhat dramatic. Likewise, the U.S. Postal Service does something that other postal services do. I don't know who was first, but we used to have, when you want to mail a letter, the price of postage would go up a penny or 3 pennies or 4 pennies every year, more than once a year, and you'd end up with all these different stamps that you'd have to hobble together to mail a letter. And then one day, they said, we're going to make a thing called the Forever Stamp, and you can mail a letter with it today, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. How hard was that? But it made people think like, wow, that really makes my life a lot easier, and it made people feel better, not good necessarily, but better towards the Postal Service. So again, these are one-off examples, but if a company can continuously do things that pay off people's love of simplicity, it makes them feel more attached to the company. So I mentioned before that bad things inevitably happen. You'll recall that when the iPhone 4 came out, it was the first one that had this design with the antenna that went around the edges. And there was a story that broke within a day of the phone's release that because the antenna went around the edges, if you held it in a certain way, you would short out the signal and lose your phone call. And people started attacking Apple, as they tend to do. They're very, under the microscope all the time. It got so bad that Steve had to have a news conference to explain why the antenna was very well thought out, why this is not a problem, and try to make it go away. So it was a 1-hour news conference, and I listened to it, and I saw that he was heavily playing the love card. So I took his 1 hour and I whittled it down to about 45 seconds to prove my point. And it goes like this.
I love you so much.
We want to make all of our users happy. We love making our users happy. We make all our users happy. We care about every user. We want every user to be happy. We care about every user. What motivates us is to just have them love them. So we love our users. We love our users so much. We do all this because we love our users. We love our customers. We love our users. We really love them.
I love you so.
Yes, he did. A lot of people don't realize that was Steve's thing with every presentation, not just that one. Anytime he introduced a new product, he'd distill it to its essence, and then he would beat it to death. But he did it in a very Steve-like way, so he could get away with that. The idea of doing fewer things better has been built into Apple for a very long time, and it has to do not only in their products, but with their communications and their product lines and everything about the company. Steve very famously said that innovation is saying no to 1,000 things. Obviously, you could put a ton of features into an iPhone. Apple is certainly capable of doing that. They purposefully do not because they're trying to keep it simple. And they make it easy for people to use very advanced features. Samsung has a different philosophy, and a lot of people like it. There's nothing wrong with that, but they have a lot of features in there that can get in the way. So there's a difference of philosophy there. If you look at the lineup of products that people offer, it's kind of funny. If you go to Dell, they have 26 distinct models of laptops. If you go to HP, they've got 41, and if you go to Apple, they have a mere 3. You're all aware of market share, and Apple has never really done particularly well in the world of market share. But there's a thing called profit share, which is the share of total available profits in a category. And in that measure, Apple, with its fewer models, actually makes over 50%, more than Dell and HP combined. So they're making a hell of a lot more money by offering fewer models, and you'd think there might be a lesson in there somewhere. When Steve came back in 1997, he had the exact same challenge. Apple had over 20 distinct products, not just computers. They had Newtons, printers, scanners, cameras. They had all these things that were not particularly good. They were somewhat mediocre, actually, and each one required R&D and marketing and all that stuff. So they were splintering their resources pretty well. So when Steve introduced the iMac, he did something that I think is a hell of a lot more important. He put this grid up on the screen, and he said, we're killing basically Apple's entire product line, which I don't think any company has ever done before either. He kept only a couple of products. He stood there that day and he said, we're going to make 4 things and 4 things only, a laptop and a desktop for the consumer and for the pro. So that day he had the desktop, which was the iMac. The Power Mac remained. The PowerBook was the Pro laptop that remained. And then Steve, who is Mr. Secrecy, stood there on stage that day and said, the next thing you're going to see from us is a home version of the iMac, actually. And about 3 months later came the iBook. So this enabled Apple to make one product in each category, very few categories, and make a world-leading product in each category, as opposed to being one of the many. And that has basically guided Apple to this very day. Obviously, their grid has gotten a bit bigger, but you can still fit every product Apple makes on one of these tables. There are a couple of tables here. The moral of this particular story is that perfection is achieved not when there's nothing left to add, but when there's nothing left to remove. And this is something that's true not only in product features, product lines, it's true of PowerPoint presentations. Not that I would ever make a PowerPoint presentation. I use Keynote, of course, but you get the idea. My colleagues and I, when we put together a presentation, we go back and forth countless times, removing words and pages and paragraphs, with the belief that when you distill something down to its essence, say fewer things and say them more powerfully, it's a better presentation. Common sense is one that isn't particularly common, as many know. My example of this is in the music world, when Apple created iPod and iTunes, it revolutionized the way we discover and buy music. Apple had a very simple system. Basically, it was about $1 per song. If you buy 5 songs, you pay your $5, you get your music, end of story. Microsoft decided to get in on the action. They didn't want to use real money. They used Microsoft points. And they said, there are 80 points in $1, and you have to buy them in chunks. So if you give us $10, we'll give you 800 points, and we will charge 79 points per song. Now, to the unsuspecting customer, 79 points might sound a bit better than 99 cents, except when you did the math, you'd find out that 79 points was 99 cents. There was no difference at all, except you go through this convoluted thing where Microsoft ends up keeping some of your money. So it was all done not for the consumer, but it was done for Microsoft. And that had the opposite effect of the $1 cup of coffee and the forever stamp. Once people understood that it was more or less a scheme to make Microsoft some additional money on interest that they have in people's accounts, it's all done for Microsoft's gain and not the consumers. People kind of resent that. It's not the way to generate love. Words are very important. Steve gave this little talk back when he was 25 years old about the naming of Apple. And it's interesting, too, because you have to keep in mind that when Apple was formed, it was going up against companies like International Business Machines, and there was a company called Apple. It couldn't be more human and more different. It was a struggle back in those days, but the name still has that effect today, where it's not the name of a big, complicated company. Just that one word sets Apple apart in many ways. But Computer History Museum released this video a year or so ago. It's a horrible, glitchy video. It's unlistenable in parts. This is a tiny little clip of it, and there's one glitch in there, but you'll survive, and you'll get the meaning of it.
But we re-examined it on a regular basis, and we found that the juxtaposition of something that seemed to epitomize what we were going after, which was the simplicity and yet very refined sophistication. In our first brochure, probably some of you have it, the title of it was "Simplicity is the Ultimate Sophistication." And that wasn't just a bullshit slogan. It actually was really what we've been striving for. And the Apple seemed to symbolize that. So I think we're going to stick with it.
I like the young rock star version of Steve. He kind of started to look like a mean old man when he got ill, unfortunately, because he wasn't as mean as people would have you believe. But anyway, this is the piece he was talking about. Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication, which again I think is a fantastic thing. This was the first mass bit of communication Apple did for its very first mainstream hit. And again, you could use that line under any Apple product today and it would make sense. Simplicity in Apple's sense is not a dumbing down, it is a refining. It is making advanced capabilities easier to access. And that kind of simplicity makes you look smarter. Naming is a word-related thing, and I love the fact that Dell has all of these different names for their computers, and every time they come up with a new one, they've got to start over and teach people what it stands for. HP has a similar issue. They have all kinds of names, Pavilion. They have one actually called HP. I find that rather interesting. And then they have another called Omen. Scary. Then if you go over to Asus, one of my new favorites, I took this off their homepage just recently. This is right down to the capitalization of the words. This is exactly what you see there. And I don't see how any company sells products with names like this, really. I know for a fact that I don't hear a lot of people talking about how much they love their Asus ROG G370JW. It doesn't quite roll off the tongue as much as like a MacBook Air or a MacBook Pro. And if you take, everything Apple makes is a Mac. Every computer they make is a Mac. And if you extend it to their desktop line, they're all Macs also. They don't have to start over. People understand what it is they sell. They don't have to do the work to get to the point where they're ready to buy. And I didn't even include desktops in those other guys, but it gets even more complicated for them when you do. Minimizing is a really important thing too, and I love this particular example. Apple University is a thing that Steve created some number of years ago. And the idea was that incoming executives would learn at Apple University what makes Apple different, what its values are, and they would look at case studies from the past and try to understand why Apple made certain controversial decisions it made that define what the company is all about. One of the visual aids they use is this series of water drawings by Picasso. He did 12 of them over 12 days. I could only fit 11 on my screen, but you'll get the idea. He started with a very intricate drawing of a bull and ended up with something, extremely nothing. And yet, even though it's just a few lines and it's more pleasing to the eye, it says bull as much as the more detailed version. So this is a principle they teach there about not just product design, but again, the way you present things. You don't need all the detail to make your point in a more forceful and more appealing way. Minimizing the words is always important, and in Apple's case, humanizing the words. When they came out with the iPod, which revolutionized music, they didn't say 5 gigabyte drive and FireWire port and click wheel interface. You could find all that stuff on the internet, but what they said to the world in their mass communication was simply 1,000 songs in your pocket. Human, simple words that echoed quite loudly, because at that time your average music player couldn't hold more than 1 or 2 CDs. So 1,000 songs in your pocket was ridiculous. But again, common words, human words, and they help fuel a revolution. Supposedly, it was Leonardo da Vinci who said one should use common words to explain uncommon things. Another quote that I love, because I think it summarizes Apple's approach to the way it talks about things. As a creative director in advertising, a lot of people come in on BMW and Apple, and people perceive those as intelligent accounts. They would write these very intelligent headlines with big words, and I used to have to beat them down and say that you actually sound smarter if you don't use the big words. So it's an important thing to consider, is not trying to impress people with specs and words that are longer than 3 syllables. No, there's no syllable limitation, but you get the idea. The bottom line is that being simple is not simple. It takes a ton of work. Steve Jobs succeeded because he was 2 things: not only a champion of simplicity, but he was a brutal foe of complexity. And that's where you hear the stories about the various explosions of temper you might have heard about, because he didn't tolerate when people were getting in the way of the plan. I think for Steve, and I think everyone should give it a try, simplicity is this lens through which you look at everything, and it isn't just the communications, it's the structure of a company, it's the way you go about developing new ideas, products, services. It's just people who have the ability to simplify things really have the ability to make their companies stand out, because in this sense, simplicity is the ultimate competitive weapon. That's when iPhone came out. It had 1 button compared to the BlackBerry, which was the standard at the time, which was, again, a sea of buttons. They were able to get everything down to the point where you could just pick it up and use it and not need a manual, which was a pretty amazing thing. My favorite quote from Steve is this one, that simple can be harder than complex. You have to work hard to get your thinking clean to make it simple, but it's worth it in the end, because once you get there, you can move mountains. And if someone just walked up to me on the street and said that, I would probably thank them for their wisdom and be on my merry way. But when you think that this is Steve who said it, and that he took a company that was near bankruptcy and turned it into the most valuable company on earth in a mere 14 years, with this being his philosophy, it's probably worth listening to. Not that he couldn't have said it a bit simpler if he tried. Whoops, sorry. Dramatic effect ruined by my excessive clicking, sorry. Simple can move mountains, but his version has a bit more eloquence, so I will stick with him on that one. And now, although this appears to be the end, it's a false ending, and I'm going to do something really quick. Just because I think you have a sense of humor. Haven't seen a big indication of it yet, but bear with me on this. I don't think anyone here has ever really seen this website called Scupertino. I always ask the question. I don't ask anymore because nobody ever raises their hand. 5 million people have now visited Scupertino. It's a site I do with my design partner. And it's basically a satire site based on Apple. Apple-based humor. You would think there aren't a lot of people out there doing that. We do it for fun. This is not a mercenary plea. We don't make any money. There are 2 little Google ads, and we make like $4 a month, which doesn't even pay for our web space. But it's a labor of love. And I was just going to share a couple of Scupertino stories with you. Scupertino, in case you haven't figured it out, is a variation of Cupertino, which is the headquarters of Apple. So I'm just going to give you a couple little Scupertino stories to wet your whistle, and maybe you'll come back for a laugh now and then. But while we're wearing our Apple hats, I thought perhaps you would enjoy this. So we created a product called Apple Water. A lot of these things go viral, and you'll see them around, and maybe not attribute them to us. But we make fun of all the things that people criticize Apple for. All they want is your money. They're just trying to control the world. They don't really invent anything themselves. And an example of that would be right here. Molecular perfection. Literally twice as many hydrogen atoms as there are oxygen atoms, right? Only from Apple, of course. People think, even though we have a masthead that says very clearly this is a satire site, you would be surprised by reading the comments how many people really believe Apple is doing these things. Go figure. Well, we created an ad for Apple Water. If you're an Apple fanboy, you've got Apple on the outside. Now you can have it on the inside. And to go along with our fake product, we created a new fake product called Apple Water Pro, right? We talked about that problem with the iPhone reception. Well, it was actually your fault, you and your fleshy fingers. So we created the iHand, which was a wooden hand that you would hold in your hand and put the phone in the wooden hand, and that you wouldn't have the problem anymore. End of story. And we had all the different races covered here, including iHand Kermit down here in the lower right. And then, oh yes, and it had this telescoping rod here, so you could hold it at a comfortable distance from your own ear, or perhaps to that of a colleague, right? And then last, and I promise I'm leaving, Leif here is getting very upset now because he's saying, my time is, no, really, I'm only 2 minutes over. Daggers in his eyes. No, he's being a very nice guy. When the cardinals came together to elect a new pope, we took occasion to run this story on Scupertino, which was that Vatican shocker that the cardinals had tapped Siri as the new pope. Because, there's several good reasons, but here we have the conclave asking Siri this question, which is the Pope Catholic? And the answer is currently yes, but you can change this in preferences, right? So that's it from the world of Scupertino. We change stories about once a month there. If you're ever in the mood for a chuckle, come on over and visit. But anyway, there's no false ending here. This really is the ending. So I'm going to go sit here with this guy. But thank you so much for your kind attention.